Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Daniel Foor, and I'm here for a conversation with a friend and colleague, Dr. Siobhan Watkins, microbiologist, and we'll be talking today about microanimism and our relationship with the very small kin. And Shiv, I want to introduce her and say a few things about her. As I said, she's an environmental microbiologist specializing in getting to know, examine, work with microorganisms in soil, freshwater, and wastewater. Since 2003, she's worked in industry, commercial applications, and academic research and faculty positions. She's also a professor. And since 2016, she's been a student of West African Ifa, Orisha tradition, animism, ancestor reverence with me as a mentee. And her living family is from the British Isles, and she's of Scottish and Welsh ancestry. And she's the founder of microanimism.com. So for more context on her offerings, check out microanimism.com. She's currently based in San Francisco and has a business offering natural solutions to sustain the health of medicinal plants. And she also lives in Albuquerque, the high desert. So with that, welcome, Shiv. And for folks who don't know anything about me or my background, just encountering this interview, for more information on my practice, you could see ancestralmedicine.org. And I'm a teacher of earth-honoring spirituality and traditions, and I have a PhD in psychology. So, but with that, welcome, Shiv. It's good to be here with you.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say by way of just welcoming us into this conversation on animism and the very small kin?
Yeah, I'm really excited. I'm really stoked to be having this conversation at all with somebody else, and that other people are going to see it, and you know, the usual kind of gratitude towards the ancestors and the supportive spirits, and hopefully this is going to be productive and useful to folks with their support. And also I think it's apropos to welcome and say thank you to the many millions of other beings that are joining in on this conversation just by virtue of being attached to you and me, and being attached to the surface of my laptop and looking in from outside from a very rainy day. So gratitude to everybody who's here, and exciting.
It's good. I have the sense that they are often not used to being consciously welcomed in by the humans. So why don't you start, Shiv, if you would, by sharing with our listeners, many of whom are not microbiologists themselves, something about, you know, it's a big terrain of so many different kinds of beings that are being, in a sense, defined relative to us just based on their size, not necessarily what they have in common with one another. So within this large domain of microbiology, where have you specialized, and maybe a little bit about what drew you into the field to begin with?
My entire career has been accidental. I had a very irresponsible approach to it. And really, I would have to say that I am consciously relating to the folks, the smalls, the microbes that I've been working with for most of my career. And now that I look back on it, I realize that there were ways that I was doing that, of course, without understanding it. But I now focus on the environment, and really what first got me interested in bacteria and microbes as a child was illness, which sounds kind of morbid, but I think when you're little, you're naturally interested in the things that don't make you feel great. And so because I was a precocious, overachieving child, I read up a lot on disease and things like that, and that's probably what sparked more than anything my natural interest in microbes and microbial life. And obviously there's way more to microbes than what they do to or for us, but that's probably where I first started out. And really I've always focused on bacteria for the most part in my career. and bacterial viruses, but of course the microbial world extends to fungi, archaea, prions, arguably some parasitic worms and things like that as well. So there's a whole lot of folks out there to communicate with and relate to.
And your work now focuses on disease smalls that cause harm to others who are plants rather than humans, yeah?
Yeah, and this is, overall, this is a really interesting concept to me, this idea of disease, and it's something that microbiologists, scientists can't really agree on in terms of microbes. There's this idea that I think in popular science you hear a lot this notion of good bacteria and bad bacteria, and that's really not a thing. Bacteria don't have a moral compass. They're pretty much ambivalent, right? They're really not interested in what we do day to day, to be fair.
I think of it much like the category of weeds, which makes sense if you're a gardener based on which plants you're trying to eat.
Yeah, for sure. It's really difficult to categorize microbes generally. It's difficult to categorize microbes as well as being pathogenic or not being pathogenic. It more than often depends on the situation that they're in. So if you use E. coli as an example, lots of people will have heard of E. coli as being something that can make people very, very unwell. It can cause kidney failure in children. You get it from eating raw meat, food poisoning, bad luck. But E. coli in our guts also produces all of our vitamin K for us. So if we didn't have this relationship with E. coli taken in the good and the bad as well, we wouldn't have vitamin K. And also we wouldn't have a horrible disease that kills people too. But it's really, really difficult to classify microbes at all. And even though we assign species, genus, all that kind of thing to microbes, bacteria, viruses, and fungi, a lot of microbiologists will argue now that that concept is very unhelpful to us. It doesn't really matter what we call them. It just depends. Are they in the soil? Are they in your gut? What's influencing them? And how are they functioning, right? It's not about a name. It's about ultimately what they're doing in the moment that you're looking at them. They're very present, I guess, is a good way of it.
It's a great segue. In terms of other aspects of traditional lore and wisdom, we can look to intact or what's knowable about indigenous cultures for lore on, let's say, the bear or bear spirit. But it's not that humans have not been in relationship with E. coli for as long as we've been in relationship with bear, but I don't have the impression that traditional peoples were chatting about E. coli in quite the same way as we do now, because of the ability to extend perception through microscopes, different kinds of technologies that we have now. And so so it's an old relationship that is now being talked about in a new way. And is there anything that can be generalized about the smalls? I mean, with plants, for example, we can say most plants tend to photosynthesize, and animals don't tend to do that. But I know there are cyanobacteria, which are small and photosynthesize, although many don't. Like, are there qualities that hold across the board besides just being small in scale relative to us?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something, as a recovering academic, that I've always struggled with, this idea that it's quite endearing, right? Because human beings and scientists especially like to try and do that. They like to put things in boxes, and they like to have words that they can use, because it makes life easier for us. And I've tried to do that. But honestly, I think with the microbial world and with every type of being that it encompasses, because, you know, bacteria, fungi, viruses, even if you just look at bacteria, one group, it's really difficult to generalize bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
on every level, in terms of where you find them geographically, in terms of what they use as a food source, in terms of how they reproduce. Do they reproduce by binary fission, or do they have sex, or do they suck up pieces of DNA from the environment? There's so much going on, and I think as a scientist, but also as a dirt worshipper as well, that feels quite dangerous to me, and not disrespectful necessarily, just kind of you know, endearing in a human and naive way to try and generalize like that. And that's the impression that I get, and some of that comes from my approach to them in reverence, but also as a scientist, knowing how much I don't know. I'm being painfully aware of all the things.
I wonder about one generalization that, if it could hold, besides being smaller than us. So it's not like they're objectively small compared to neutrinos or something. They're massive. But it's my impression that many humans have an illusion of being relatively separate from other humans, and that rhizomatic plants, let's say, tend to have an easier access to a group consciousness. And if I really drop in with a pine tree, even if it's a quirky kind of specific pine tree, it's probably aware of other pine trees and has access to pine tree as a consciousness, right? Do you have this impression of the diverse kinds of bacteria, let's say, that they, on the whole, have a kind of group consciousness? Is that safe to generalize?
Yeah, I think absolutely I'd say that. And that's part of the reason why I don't really identify with them necessarily as being small. I mean, you know, tangibly they're tiny, and that makes it hard to work with them in a lab or whatever. Whenever I drop in with them, or whenever I'm thinking, you know, consciously thinking about how I relate with them, and the interactions that I have with them and the impact that they've had on my life, I don't picture them as individuals. It's definitely a community, and it's huge and grounded, and it's just there. It feels like a mountain, you know what I mean? It's like a mountain of microbes, and there's definitely a single consciousness there, which you can pull apart and go into a little bit deeper and hang out with, you know, different sections of that consciousness. But it almost relates in a way to the Gaia Theory that Lynn Margulis put forward with one of her co-workers about this idea of Earth as being a single organism. And there are issues with that idea, but for me personally, that's how I see the smalls as well, as one big collective, because they're ancient as well, right?
So if you take a etiquette angle, like drawing from animist, you know, spirituality or ritual or things like that, principles, core values, and someone wishes to approach respectfully, it matters, are you going to approach an individual, a group, a collective, something like that? So if someone, let's say, wanted to understand more directly E. coli, would it be your recommendation that they would approach the collective as a kind of hive Borg group organism that exists simultaneously in all the places that those bacteria are in this moment?
It's my impression from the work that I've done with them that first and foremost, what's important is that you kind of sort your own shit out. As I remember you saying a couple of years ago when we first started working together about relating to other spirits, it looks strange to them if you aren't good with your ancestors and your people first. So I absolutely think that applies in this situation as well. That, you know, you need to have that kind of foundation, because
yeah, say more if you can about why you think it matters. I mean, I'm biased that I agree with you, but
right.
How would you break it down to someone who's skeptical or could hear that as like a should or a moralistic thing?
Well, you know, fundamentally, I think when you're talking about the smalls, it's edgy. It's an edgy group. right? They basically provide the foundation for every biological process that happens on the earth. They have a lot of power. They have a huge amount of power, and they wield it in a very measured, level way. And thanks to that, you know, thanks very much. We have life as we know it now. But if at any point they decided to go Mars attacks on any of us, that would be the end of it. You know, there's a really great quote by Tom Curtis about if the last blue whale choked to death on the last giant panda, it would be heartbreaking, but the world would go on. And if we lost all of the ammonia oxidizing bacteria on the planet, that would be it. Everything would stop straight away. So I think it's very important to demonstrate humility here and to recognize that you can't just, you know, go, hey, what's up, E. coli? How's it going? Are you up for a chat? You have to demonstrate that you have done some work on yourself. You have done some work on behalf of the community and for your people. And that kind of gives you the entry pass into approaching the smalls. And I would say that to start off approaching them as a community, maybe in the yard with the soil, or if you go to the sea and dip your feet in the sea and go to the collective, and the collective, you're going to get a sense from the collective as to whether or not it's good to continue. But it's a respect thing, and it's not an immediate relationship. It's a strange relationship as well, because like you said, I don't know as they're used to people approaching them in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking about in terms of, like, if I want to approach the bear, I'm coming back to the bear again, I could gather my own ancestors of blood who I'm in relationship with, and that, I think, extends a notch more credibility, because they can vouch for me. We're coming as a group rather than I'm just an isolated individual with no context. I could, beyond that, identify ones among my own ancestors, or perhaps beyond that, who during their life knew the bear, so that there's an established pathway of relationship between human and bear. And so I could say, all the ancestral, you know, spirited folk who are related with bear, can you help me to bridge into this dialogue with bear directly? But I don't know that there are such bridge humans with the smalls.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's almost becomes scholarly if you start thinking about the relationship that humans have had since the dawn of time with microbes. It's not like looking at the relationship that humans have had with horses, because there's not really any record, because when we first discovered them, which was very, very recently, we spectacularly misunderstood what they were anyway. But having said that, I mean, of course, our ancestors had some kind of relationship with them in terms of farming and disease and brewing, you know, bread making, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question around consciousness. And
it's like, are there gatekeepers? If there were a force that you could imagine that would be a kind of mediating force to make sure that a listener who wanted to bring their sincere curiosity to these elder, complicated, sort of untamed, foundational beings, would you recommend a person rely on their own ancestors for that kind of mediating chaperone, if you will, energy? Or
I would definitely recommend that you bring your ancestors on board, just as a kind of protective element. But I mean, and this is me kind of making this up in terms of based on the other training that I've done and the conversations that we've had. It might be a good idea if you have a particularly strong relationship, or if you're an ally with a particular plant, to start off with the plant, or if you're particularly good with a place, you know, like
sure, yeah. So a friend of a friend. So you come recommended. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, the first time I really went out and started doing this was out in the desert, in the high desert in New Mexico. and I hung out with the juniper tree for a little while. And then I started hanging out with the dirt and the sand around the juniper tree, and you know, it becomes more inward. But I think if you were to just go in and just be like, sup, let's hang out with the smalls, I don't know as you'd get that much of a response. My overwhelming sense from them is very stoic, and when we first approached them about doing this kind of work, their response was like, sure, go ahead, see what happens, you know, but they're busy, they're doing a lot, and if you don't approach them in a way that they're going to be responsive towards, then you're not going to get the most out of that relationship, I don't think. And I guess that applies for most of the...
Let's talk about colonialism for a second, and about our shared British ancestors, and about the way that some among them had a habit of coming across new things and seeing them through a filter of unreasonable confidence. And
that's an interesting way of putting it.
and inappropriate high self-assessment.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have the same view. Perhaps it's a leading question, but if you have the same view of the if we look at just the last 100 years of humans of diverse ancestries, of course not just European ancestries, really radically expanding our knowledge of and maps of and ability to track and perceive the smalls. If you ask the smalls to kind of back up and give an assessment of how culturally polite and mindful the last 100 years have been, how would you characterize it? I mean, or how would, and I don't mean to ask you to speak for them, but you get the question I'm asking. Yeah.
I think that's a really tricky question, and I think that would be a really in-depth conversation to have with them. And honestly, and this is my impression, this is not anything that's coming from them, I'm not entirely sure how much they would have noticed that stuff. I think what is noticeable to them is, I mean, if we're talking about, so let's use the human microbiome as an example. And if you're talking about this idea that the microbes that associate with you, that exist on you, should be treated as another organ, just as important as your liver or as your lungs or your heart, because if they go away, there's no you, right? There's nothing like that. So say, for example, excessive sugar intake, refined sugar intake, the impact that has on your health as a human being, or smoking, the impact that has on your health as a human being, that has a massive impact on them as well. And these pressures that force them to change and move the equilibrium of populations in a way that it was never supposed to go, that's what they notice. And yeah, I mean, in terms of historically, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that would be a viable way to map?
I think that it's my assumption as an animist that politeness matters as a principle, or etiquette, by whatever name, matters across different kinds of people, different kinds of species, different kinds of forms, whether it's a mountain, E. coli, the bear, one's ancestors, a deity. And the contours of politeness are going to vary from situation to situation. So the focusing question really is, if I imagine I'm the first microbiologist to really get a hold of a high-powered microscope and to be like, whoa, radical recalculating, what are we looking at here? Like, so the whole world of microbiology starts to unfold a bit. And if I imagine I'm someone who's steeped in animist value set, the question I would hope would arise would be, what etiquette does this call for?
Yeah.
What kinds of politeness are warranted? And maybe it's understanding first, what does E. coli like? What are the things that it eats? and actually gathering those things, making an offering, and being like, I intend to come in a most conscious way, knowing that our forms are quite different, and knowing that I've already been unconsciously feeding you, as have my ancestors for thousands of generations, but I just noticed you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Like someone you're having dinner with, you're standing on their, you're on their foot, and you're like, oh, sorry, hello. And so the curiosity about what is best etiquette is the fallback on the etiquette if you don't know it.
Yeah, I think intention is a big thing there as well.
Yeah.
I think, you know, you can approach a lot of powers or energies and be like, come in to say hi. I'm really sorry if anything I does pisses you off. It's because I don't know any better. It's because I'm completely ignorant. Like, help me to see how I can build a relationship with you. And I think that's valid in this case as well, for sure. I think there's a huge amount of value in what I just mentioned about going to a specific place. You know, this idea, if you have some kind of really strong relationship to a particular spot, somewhere, anywhere, wherever it is, where you're already relating with beings there, I think that's a really good place to start. I think it's just, you know, this idea of, I've already been doing this work, I'm already relating, you know, I'm good with my people, and if I'm not good with my people, I'm working on everything with my people, and I come to you as a community, you know, and I recognize that you're part of my community too, so I want to relate to you, and let's talk about that, and is there anything I can do to support you, because I recognize that you make my life possible, kind of.
There's a habit in Buddhist teaching of, Tibetans will sometimes speak of it as the rainbow body, or the way in which direct embodied knowing of how interdependent things are can cause even the most stable qualities like metal or stone to reveal themselves as transient, changing, a bit empty, if you will. And it dovetails so easily into, you know, science in general, and the reality that, oh, it is actually quite spacious, and even the most seemingly solid things are mostly empty, as it were. And so I'm just thinking, instead of the rainbow body, it's a bit of the micro, you know, I don't know what the right word for it is, but to see places, to see people as very fluid ecologies rather than fixed nouns. And it leads me into my next question, which is, how have you noticed bringing an animist sensibility to what you've already been steeped in as a microbiologist? How have you noticed it's impacted you as a person? And how's it working on you?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting conversation in itself, if we look at it generally as this idea of combining any kind of scientific knowledge or training with spiritual training. There's a really interesting intersection there, and have experienced kind of antagonistic attitudes from both sides, for sure. You know, in academic science, which is academic science, it's often an unspoken rule that you can't be religious and be a good scientist, which is scientism,
which is a whole worldview that's different than science on the rocks. Yeah,
there's so many reasons why that doesn't make sense. Not least the fact that it doesn't allow any room for creativity whatsoever. And to me, the absolute foundation of good science is creativity. But then also on the other side, a lot of spiritual folks, some hippies I know, don't trust scientists,
right,
for whatever reason. And you know, that's okay. There's not much you can do about that. For me personally, it's been so much more enriching in the work, the academic work that I've done, the research work that I've done, to have a conscious relationship with these guys, and to be consciously grateful towards them as well. It's a really tricky situation when you're working in a lab versus working in a field somewhere, because as soon as you remove a handful of soil from the environment and start growing up microbes in the lab, it's like sending a human being into space. You're changing everything about what is comfortable for them, about their place, their role in the environment, their metabolism, everything. And it helps me to know that I can say to them, I get this is a thing that's happening for you, and I'm really grateful that you're still here, and what can I do to ease your discomfort, that kind of thing. And I'm not going to say that, oh, I've published 500 papers as a result and I have millions of dollars worth of grant money just through microanimism. That's not true. But personally, it's added an extra layer of richness. It's kind of added to the tapestry of my work. And it's very nurturing as well. And day to day, when things aren't going so right in the lab, when things aren't working the way that I expected, instead of being crushed and despondent, there's comfort there, because it's part of a community and doing.
And we're certainly never alone in that sense.
Yeah, but it's it has been good to recognize consciously what I'm actually doing to them. And a lot of the work I've done has involved killing microbes with lots of viruses and things, and poking and prodding, and it's essentially domesticating them in quite harsh ways. And that's an interesting talking point that I'm still kind of getting through in my head. But yeah, it's good. Overwhelmingly, it's been very positive and affirming.
So just to reflect back one piece of that, you are saying that your relationships with microorganisms is a source of relational, psychological intimacy and enjoyment for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love science. I love being a scientist. I love microbiology. I love the hardcore science aspects of it. It's what gets me going. I've been doing it for a long time. And this has just really added to that. It's really opened the work up in a way that wasn't accessible to me before, because I didn't realize it was. And now I can understand, back when I was a PhD student or whatever, how unconsciously relating with the microbes had an effect on me. But now in the last few years that it's opened up, it's glorious. It's really awesome.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about identity and the microorganisms. And you have the stats better than I would on how many, other than Daniel, microorganisms are inhabiting the Daniel body at the moment. And talk to me first, inform us a little bit on that, and also speak, if you would, to the question of, are they me? Are they this body? Like, how do you approach that? What's the etiquette there?
Well, I mean, in terms of your second question, they're not you.
But would I be me without them?
No.
Wait a minute, the bottom just gave out.
Yeah, right. It's you absolutely wouldn't be you without them. I mean, physiologically, you wouldn't be able to function. Did you ever read that book, The Andromeda Strain, by Michael Crichton?
I haven't. Yeah.
It's so there's a part in that where they talk about how the military were researching some kind of super antibiotic that would just wipe out every single pathogen organism on the human body, and people were dying in really horrible ways. And I mean, it's hyperbole, but it's kind of true, because you absolutely wouldn't be able to function without your microbiome. And there are aspects of you, probably emotionally, psychologically, personally, that are influenced by them as well. For sure, there are a lot of links to the microbiome and depression. It's particularly interesting for me as a lifelong depressive. And there are also, so aside from just being within you, everybody has. Is that
true, by the way, besides being poetic? Do you know if it's accurate that getting one's hands in the dirt actually can alter your microbiome in a way that contributes to some alleviation of depression in some cases?
I don't I don't know is I could go outside and have a paddle in the dirt and that it would fix all of that, but it's
it seems a bit simplistic, but in some ways poetically in the terrain that we're speaking to. Yeah.
There's a lot of chicken and egg research, right? A lot of we did this to rats and they got depressed, and it's like, did they get depressed because we changed their microbiome, or were they depressed and then that changed their microbiome? But I mean, if you look at things like that, like just as if you have stomach flu or if you have a cold or something like that, then the composition of your insides is definitely going to change. Especially if you're taking antibiotics for an infection or something, that has a big impact on your microbiome. So other diseases, other syndromes as well, they do too. And it's very, very hyped at the moment, microbiome research. There's a lot of hype around things like controlling obesity, using the gut microbiome, things like that. It's a long way off, but everybody has a microbial signature, if you like. And this is very tangible, this microbial cloud that everybody wafts around. So if you walk through the room, you'll waft. And if I go outside and go to the bus stop and catch a bus, I'll waft my cloud throughout the bus. And that's been used to convict people of murder. Now, forensic microbiology is becoming a thing. So we definitely have a signature. And that's
you're speaking of the air surrounding the body having a microbiological signature that's unique to each person.
Yeah, it's a trip, right? It's think of how much you're shedding. Just, you personally.
Let's stick with it around this concept of who am I? I mean, of course, there's so much we could explore there, but
yeah.
Do you have a number, just a reference about how many range, are we talking millions, billions of other than Daniel organisms?
There's so these statistics change all the time, and I think every single one of them is probably completely wrong, but the most up-to-date one I heard is that in your body, for every one human cell, there are 100 bacterial cells.
Okay, so in any case, safe to say there's more not me than me?
Totally, and that's not taking into account viruses, archaea, worms, things like that.
So can I want to slow down around that. We aren't, it's not clear how that should land psychologically.
Right.
How does it land for you all? Why are we using the second person singular here?
The good news is that there's not much you can do about it. So
it's not upsetting. It's just do I have the authority to speak for them? Is the thing that thinks that it's Daniel really only Daniel and not them already? Who's already been speaking here?
I don't have a clear answer for that. What I will suggest is that you can't speak on their behalf. I mean, even if you wanted to, you can't speak on their behalf.
But is there a me separate from their behalf? I don't like it. If it's a parliament, the things that are not them are sorely outnumbered. Like if each word is a vote, they're in the minority party. Cellularly speaking, yeah.
Yeah, the short answer for this is like, I don't know. Science doesn't know. We don't know.
Sure.
I think it's really, really easy as well, and very, very human to start being possessive about it, to start saying things like my microbes and your microbes. And I get
from their perspective, I could imagine the possibility of them thinking of it as their human, so to speak, or their
if you think about microbial lifespans, there's a huge rate of turnover. You know, a bacterium doesn't last very long, and it just so happens that at that given point in time, they're there up your nose or in your ear or wherever, and they're like, yeah, this will work for now. And that's really all it is. And yeah, they're there because their ancestors are there and something seeded that environment. And for the most part, that seed comes from your mother and from the place that you were born and everything like that. But it's not, yeah, they're not yours. And they could go away and you'd have no way of getting them back, you know?
Do you find that it could be beneficial to consciously, and maybe this is just tinkering with what already is in an abstract way, but to hold intent that if we say the body, not my body, but the body, which is largely, other than Daniel, organisms, but there's some genetic information, some cells that we could legitimately identify as human in the mix as well. And to hold intent that the human and the other than human collective that is the Daniel be harmonized, that there's a acknowledgement of both and a reorganization of the mental picture of Daniel that includes both. And I mean, maybe they just carry on either way and they're like, you can reframe it however you want, you're along for the ride.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's nuance to this. There's layers to this.
Sure, I feel it as we try to speak of it. There's a kind of buzz, and they're like, "Oh, you're talking about us."
Right? It's
yeah,
cool, right?
We are.
And I don't want to give the impression that we're just kind of like a container, you know, like a gross flesh jar that's filled up with microbes and stuff, because a very base biological and molecular levels, we interact with them and we mix up our stuff with them. So our genome, there's a lot of microbial influence. So yeah, there's this crossover on a molecular level between lots of different types of microbes and humans. The human genome is 8% viral in origin. So it's 8% of every human being's genome is from a virus, and it's not junk. It does really, really important stuff.
Now you're not talking about way in the past. Are you talking about like horizontal gene transfer and like the incorporation of the viral elements along the way?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a part of it. There's lots of contemporary stuff like that goes on as well. But there's a whole subdiscipline of virology called paleovirology, which is, and it came about mostly because of the new technologies in sequencing and deep sequencing and next generation sequencing. And these are guys who just spend their whole time mapping through the genomes of mammals and plants for viral fossils, basically. So in terms of that 8%, I can't remember the exact number, something like 45 million years ago. Like this didn't just happen with humans. We're talking about mammalian evolution generally. And these kinds of events, they didn't just happen once and then get inherited down the line. They've happened, 10, 20, 30 distinct times in parallel, apparently unrelated, all ending up with the same effect in contemporary mammals, modern day humans, that kind of thing. And I think that blows my mind on a regular basis. That's astonishing that not only has a virus given us the capacity for placental birth, because they have, but viruses gave us that 10 separate times in rodents, mice, bats, whatever, just in parallel, completely unrelated. And it kind of indicates intent, but I'm not in a position, and I wouldn't deem to suggest that was the case. But
let me work in another fun intellectual question with real implications in our time here, which is the "is it alive" question. I have a minor in environmental studies, and I'm a fan of science. I'm an amateur naturalist, and I know that generally most scientific folk wouldn't consider a stone alive, but would consider an elm tree alive, and would consider bacteria alive, and viruses, I think, and prions. Complicated. So my two questions are there areas of microbiology where is it alive gets kind of weird? And then how is it for you as someone who's internalizing and working from animist sensibilities to hold this is it alive question in your field?
Yeah. Well, first of all, totally, the whole is it alive thing is a big deal in microbiology, and everybody seems to be pretty much in agreement. Yep, bacteria are here because they reproduce on their own, they excrete, they eat, they do all of that good stuff, all of those nice, neat little definitions of what life is. They've got it covered. Viruses, microbiologists have been arguing about that for a really, really long time, because viruses can't do anything on their own. They're just little scraps of nucleic acid packaged up in a protein, and they float around aimlessly until they accidentally collide with the host. They can't reproduce on their own. They don't eat. They don't excrete. They don't do anything. But the argument, the academic argument, scholarly argument, is that viruses have such a huge impact on the tree of life, in terms of what they do contemporarily, in terms of the impact that they have on higher animals' genomes, all of that, they should be classified as alive just on the basis of that.
Well, the exclusionary category of they can't do anything on their own, it sounds like humans are in that category.
Yeah, this is in relation to that very neat little list of seven things that was created, I don't know, millennia ago by an old guy. I'm being very flippant about it. But yeah, there's like 7 things that something has to do in order to be classified as being alive. And definitely a mountain doesn't fall into that territory. Definitely a river doesn't fall into that territory. And definitely a virus doesn't fall into that territory. So as an animist and coming from that kind of perspective, it almost makes it a bit easier for me, because I can relate to a virus, different types of viruses, and be, of course that's alive. Like, how could it not be alive? And I have to form slightly more robust arguments when I'm talking to other scientists.
Of course, Graham Harvey's work for me, and I think by extension for you, has been influential. And one of the things that Graham unpackages in a way that landed strongly for me is one of the things people seem to mean when they ask, is it alive, is it relational? Is it a potential source of, is it responsive? Is there a sense of agency or, potential for relating? Yeah. And so someone may be dead to you, and in a sense, they're functionally dead. They don't want to relate with you. Whether that's the spirit of a bear who's just like, you try to tune in, you cannot find a response, or your partner if they don't want to talk to you. And yet, so part of what I mean by that is that a mountain may be dead until it's turned its attention to you, in which case it's alive, in which case it may become dead again to you by turning its attention away from you. And then we get into, are you able to perceive? Just because you're not, if you don't have your eyes open, it doesn't mean the world around you doesn't exist. And although to you it may seem non-existent. Yeah.
I'm interested. I've always forgotten to ask you this because we always ended up talking about lots and lots of other things. I'm interested about, if you've looked back and recognized how you've interacted with the smalls now, after we've been having these conversations and doing some of this work, if you can identify at any point that you're like, yeah, no, that was them and I just didn't realize it at the time.
I haven't given a great deal of focused attention to them. I have at times tuned in with viruses that I have encountered, or I got a amoebic dysentery in Ecuador, and it
focus your attention.
Very uncomfortable. So when ones that are functioning relative to me as pathogens have come into my field of awareness, I, out of a sense of suffering and desperation, have taken a relational approach to try to beg for mercy at times. Mm-hmm. And that, as it helped, I don't know, it seemed better somehow. Maybe it brought me some comfort, but it seemed polite at least. It's a bit of an opportunistic angle, because I'm only praying when you're in dire straits, and I'm only going to adopt good values when I'm in a pinch. But I am glad to know of the smalls and to what happens for me around the question of ancestry, because of course I'm steeped in that with my work. And when I dial it back, which time is weird in spirit terrain, so I say dial it back, but it's also looking at other layers that are present in the moment. They're here, they're in the present. So if I look at other pre-Homo sapien hominid layers, pre-hominid, pre-mammal, pre-animal, our common dinoflagellate ancestor with the fungi, like earlier common ancestors with even multicellular organisms. So when I have occasionally gone down that pathway of inquiry, mostly I just feel very odd and tranced out, and like it is a comfort to put on my name again, and in reorienting. So I think that our sense of individual self and the illusion of being localized in the body and of responding to a certain name is very adaptive and pragmatic and important. And we don't want to be away from that for too long, and because we could, forget to come home, perhaps. I don't know that it's a big risk per se, but if your sense of self is relatively porous, then you might want to be careful how thoroughly you contemplate the consciousness of the smalls.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking about, I can't remember who I was talking to about this, but they mentioned mushrooms, specifically in relation to psilocybin. And mushrooms, they kind of fall under the classification of microbiology as well. They're eukaryotic, but we still claim them as our own. And I guess because fungi technically, well, not technically, evolutionarily are more closely related to animals than they are to plants.
Sure.
That's almost maybe quite a nice conduit there. That just popped into my head, and I'd be interested to talk to anyone who had some kind of psychedelic experience, specifically with mushrooms, that maybe opened something up to them. It'd be interesting. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with that work to anticipate what would happen, but
I've heard rumors that psilocybin can open certain pathways, and could probably put you in touch with people that could speak to those things.
Yeah.
And I have the sense of the fungi in general of being, they're strange, whole different conversation type of consciousness, but they do strike me as our heterotroph kin as being a bit more similar to us than plants and how they move and operate. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are really strong parallels there, and Paul Stamets has spoken extensively about that kind of thing, which is really, really interesting. They're enigmatic as well, I think, fungi. I don't know how charismatic bacteria and viruses are in comparison to fungi and plants and animals and things like that. I don't know. I'm completely biased. I have no solid concept of it.
Right. Tell our listeners, if you would, Shiv, about some of the ways that folks could be in contact with you in terms of your services or offerings in the world. I know you're busy with your research, with the, your day job, as it were, and also with teaching, and yet you have additional services that you're offering through microanimism and your practice. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm really happy to offer this kind of stuff to anyone, really. So the website microanimism.com, that's where folks can find writing around this, and they can sign up for a newsletter if they want to be kept up to date with things. But in terms of the services that I offer, they're kind of three-pronged. First one is biological teaching, kind of generic background information. Sometimes that's a really important part of relating to the smalls. If you don't have much biological background, just getting an idea of physically what they are. And I provide scientific consulting, and then in terms of this work, I can set up sessions with people to really work through how they can relate to smalls, and we can take them through at the very beginning, approaching the smalls, where they're coming from, their intention, what they're hoping to achieve, and we can work through a plan to make that work for them. And yeah, that's it's really exciting work. It's really enriching.
Great. Are you aware of anyone else explicitly working an animist angle with microbiology?
I am not.
Great.
Yeah, I've done some searching, but right now I'm not aware of anybody else who's doing this specifically with this, these methods.
Thank you for what you're doing, sincerely. There's a way in which you are part of a very small demographic of humans enacting a kind of interspecies diplomacy with the smalls. And so human being a big organism itself, to have 7 billion of us and almost no one enacting that kind of etiquette, thanks for helping to hold that down.
Yeah, it's I'm exceptionally grateful to be able to even start thinking about doing this and sharing with other people how we can do this. It's been a huge part of my life, and yeah, gratitude is really the best word I can think of to sum up what we're doing here.
Great. Well, thanks, Shiv. And so just to recap, if folks want to see what Shiv is up to, it's microanimism.com. And if you're into the macro levels of ritual, I am offering work with other humans and animist core values, things like that, through ancestralmedicine.org. Thanks so much, everybody.